Welcome to the RealCollect's Business Exchange platform, where small business owners can connect to real investors right there at your fingertip. For someone who's never sold a business, what are the main deal structures they should know about, asset sale versus stock sale, and why does that distinction matter?
Sure. So asset sale versus stock sale matters primarily from a tax perspective. I tend to use stock sales more than many lawyers that I deal with, at least down here, because I think they're cleaner. All the assets, all the liabilities go. It can be a really clean way to sell property, for example. But a lot of people do asset sales, and in certain situations there are benefits to them. I don't typically consider that something owners really need to have an opinion on from the outset, right? To me, you come in, you say, I have my business, what's the best way to sell it? Because sometimes it's going to be some combination of the two, right? It may be spin off some assets and then sell stock. It really is just highly dependent on the situation, who the buyer is. The buyer will have an opinion too, right? Because it impacts their tax basis.
So what are some common legal mistakes small business owners make when selling their business without proper guidance?
They come in all flavors. I would say a mistake that I find pretty frequently is trying to keep down your legal bills by leaving your lawyer out of early conversations or kind of ongoing conversations. In many cases, that creates far more legal work than there would have been had the lawyer been involved from the beginning. So I would, and this probably sounds self-serving, but I would get your lawyer involved earlier, because I think that you'll end up having a more efficient process and lower legal bills than you do if you bring your lawyer in later. Highly encourage people to do that.
Yeah. So walk us through a typical deal timeline from first serious conversations with a buyer to money in the bank, and where you as the M&A attorney, when and how do you get involved?
Sure. So it depends. Sometimes people will come in as soon as they want to sell their business and they think they have a buyer. Sometimes people will come in once they have a term sheet or an LOI. I like to be involved at the term sheet phase for the reasons that we just talked about, right? I think that if we can get a lot of the key terms down, not just business points, but things that people would typically consider legal, but that have real value to them. For example, are we going to have a non-compete in the agreement? Things like that. That strictly business people might not really think about to put in their term sheet, right? Because they're thinking price. And I find that having those in at an early phase can make the negotiating of the definitive agreement, the purchase and sale agreement, stock sale agreement, a lot smoother and cleaner. Yeah.
And so in your experience, what does that timeline look like?
Sure. It depends on how on top of things the client is sometimes, or you get into a scenario where one side is like really on top of things and the other side's not. And so as a lawyer, my goal is to never have things waiting on me. I'm not sure I always meet that goal, but I try to. I don't want to be the holdup. And so it depends on the deal, right? You have someone come in who has kind of a smaller business, especially if there's not real estate involved, you can move things pretty quickly, a few weeks. If the main deal points are hashed out before they come to me, sometimes even a little sooner. Real estate can slow things down a little bit because of title work, but typically that's not a huge burden. So I would say I've done deals in under a month, and then sometimes they take quite a bit longer.
Yeah. So we talked about a few things earlier: non-competes, earn-outs, seller financing. These terms potentially could be intimidating for a small business owner who's not familiar with them. So which of these do you see most often in small business deals, and how should an owner think about those?
Sure. I see a lot of seller financing, which I think is an attractive option for a lot of people. If the seller doesn't need all the money up front, it's a simple process. I think a lot of people, when they hear seller financing, think well, I'm not a bank. I don't know how to underwrite these things. But if you think of it more as you're just not getting paid all of it up front, you're getting it paid out in installments, I think it becomes a lot easier for people to understand. A lot of what I do, the legal world in general, there's just a lot of jargon, right? A lot of technical terms or things like M&A that aren't even technical terms, they're just shorthand. And a lot of those things can be intimidating for people, but I find that when you sit them down and just kind of explain what the implications are, it becomes more clear. A non-compete is a good example of something that you can read it on the paper and you understand what it means. And legally, you can say, okay, well, if we went to court, this is how the court would look at it, right? But something like a non-compete on a practical level, what does it look like for someone to actually say, you're actually going and competing with me and you're violating the agreement and I'm going to sue you? There are a lot of steps between you taking an action and you getting sued for it, right? And so I always try to sit with my clients and explain to them, what would this actually look like in the real world, right? Like if you went out, let's say it's a medical practice, I have people who retire, but they want to be able to take call at a hospital or something like that. What would this look like in reality if you went and did that? What would the buyer do? Maybe it's a technical violation, but they're not going to sue you for this. Or maybe that's a competitive thing. They really want to take you off the market, right? That's part of what they're negotiating for. Yeah. So, yeah.
So, and it's funny that we talked about seller financing, and earlier in another podcast we talked to Abby Young about, which is knowing when to be prepared for those deals. Now, a seller financing deal may not be attractive whenever you're trying to sell it in a crisis, or when you're ready, that's not as attractive. So there are less deal opportunity to be made if you're not thinking about this years in advance. So from your experience and your opinion, when should businesses even start thinking about potential exit?
Well, every business owner has different goals. I think if you're getting closer to retirement and you don't have a clear succession plan, you should certainly be thinking about it. If your goal, like a lot of entrepreneurs, the goal is to grow the business and then, sell at an attractive multiple, you start thinking about it earlier. I don't know that you need to talk to your lawyer that early, right? But if you have a relationship with a business broker, with a private equity banker, or you have access to a platform like Rioplex, start poking around, start getting your kind of ear to the ground, learning market conditions, and you may find that there's a time, maybe it's a little earlier than you planned on, but the market's really good, or you get a really attractive offer, and it's nice to be in a position to kind of jump on it.
So many owners care deeply about their employees, their community,
Sure.
Not just the price, right, of the deal. So from a legal side, how can they protect things like jobs, brand, or even customer relationships in the sale agreement?
Sure. That's a good question. And that can be difficult to do legally. From a buyer perspective, of course, they're looking at it as, look, we're buying your business and we should be able to do what we want with it, right? But this is a very valid concern that a lot of business owners have, and there are protections that you can write into a deal. You can require severance packages if they do get rid of people. You can require them, or they can agree not to change the name if that's something that you want to keep. There are various provisions we can build into an agreement that protect the people that you care about and that built the business, right? But those can be pretty contentious. So it really depends on the buyer, and a lot of it comes down to finding the right buyer and building trust with them. There's only so much that a legal document can do, right? Because taking your buyer into court is not an attractive option either. There are a lot of business owners that care about their employees, but they don't necessarily want to commit themselves to going to court and spending thousands and thousands of dollars in legal fees to protect them, right? That's a different thing entirely.
So what should owners know about personal guarantees, lease agreements, existing liabilities when they're preparing to exit so they're not surprised after closing?
Sure. When you're talking about personal guarantees, you're talking about like in the seller financing space? Or? Yeah. So having a legal entity, protects you from liability, protects you from creditors, but only to an extent, because typically the person that's taking on the obligation or is going to want personal guarantees, right? Like if you go and you take a note, for example, I'm selling to you and I'm giving you a note because I'm seller financing, right? You're going to want to say that note may be written by my company, not by me, right? But you're going to want to say, well, the company, there's not going to be anything left in the company. I need a personal guarantee. So I would sign on that personally on behalf of me, John Wilson. And in that case, a lot of your assets will become available if you have to default for whatever reason. And that also gets into, or kind of ties back into the earlier discussion about really looking at all this holistically, like what are all your assets, what are your goals, right? So you can protect assets by putting them in, say, a family trust, a family limited partnership, and then a personal guarantee would still have some teeth, but not be able to get at everything, right? So those are things to think about. Like if all your assets are in your name and you're giving a guarantee, then nothing's off limits, within reason, right? Like people can't go take your house because of homesteading laws, but most of your assets would be available. So as we wrap up, what are some questions that business owners should have or be prepared for whenever they're meeting with an M&A advisor like yourself? Sure. To me, the big one is, what are your goals? Right. What do you want to get out of this? What are the things that are important to you? Because, all of these deals, we start with kind of a stock understanding that you're selling your business, and you're going to make some representations and warranties. They're going to take it on financial terms that you guys agree to, but there's always a lot of color outside of that, right? Like specific to your business. What are your goals? Do you want to protect employees? Do you want to get paid out in seller financing, but with interest? Are you okay with non-competes? Things like that, right? So I want to understand what your goals are. I want to understand if you have a buyer on the hook, what you've agreed to with them, at least in terms of a handshake deal, right? And those are really the biggest questions. Like, what are your goals and what has been agreed to at this point?
John, anything else that we can touch on? Anything that you want to bring up or discuss that will help these small business owners, as they're in that stage or even thinking about exiting?
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing is to build a team of advisors, right? I certainly am not a one-stop shop because I'm not a CPA. I think at a minimum you're going to need a CPA and an attorney. There's some overlap, right? But it's best if they can work together. So I work with a number of attorneys, or CPAs rather, on a routine basis, and being able to pick up the phone and call, say, Abby, and say, hey, Abby, I know you're working on this deal too. What do you think about this from a tax perspective? That makes things a lot easier. But if you have your team of advisors ready to go when that deal comes in, right, or when you find that target, when you find that buyer, having your team of advisors ready to go that already knows you and kind of has an understanding of the business can really speed things along.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming in. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for everything you do for our community.
Absolutely. No, anytime. I'm glad to be here and always enjoy meeting local business owners and understanding what they need and helping to make it happen.
You're watching this podcast today. We have our trusted advisors that are going to be giving information, resources, and insights to our small businesses that are on the platform.